Colin Marshall here, breaking in a little bit early on the podcast of the Marketplace of Ideas, letting you know that if you enjoy the program, why not write a blog post about it, or a Facebook status update, or a Twitter tweet. Link your friends up to your favorite interviews, and the more people listen to the program, well, the better it's going to be. Today on the Marketplace of Ideas, a conversation with filmmaker Ramin Bahrani, director of the feature films Man Push Cart, Chop Shop, and the new Goodbye Solo. It's the Marketplace of Ideas. I'm Colin Marshall. Ramin Bahrani is the director of such films as Man Push Cart, Chop Shop, and the new Goodbye Solo. He was named somewhat controversially as being on the vanguard of the neo-realism by A.O. Scott in the New York Times, and called the new great American director by Roger Ebert. Ramin, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me.
I've been reading Roger Ebert for over 10 years now, and I've never seen him praise someone as much as he praises you. He's given your films 4 stars, just put Chop Shop on his list of the great movies, had this wonderful blog post about you. How must this feel to get such accolades from a man like Ebert?
Well, it's very humbling, and I'm very grateful for it, because Roger Ebert is a legendary critic. He is known as the most important critic in America for decades. I would like to stress it's not just me. He said this about a handful of other important directors that I really learned a lot from, like Martin Scorsese, and that kind of makes it all the more, such a wonderful feeling, because watching Mean Streets as a teenager was one of the most important, cinematic moments of my life, and what really got me interested was one of the handful of films that got me interested in making movies and what kind of movies and how to make them. And Roger has an ability to write about films in a very profound way that anyone could understand, and that's a rare gift. And so I really appreciate all that he's done for my films.
It must also feel, just looking at this from the outside, that there's a little bit of maybe a lot of an upping the ante feel to it. Like maybe, I don't know, is there a side that makes you a little bit, is there an anxiety-inducing side to this, I suppose I should ask?
I think it's natural for any artist when the work seems to be catching on and people are paying attention and enjoying it, that there's always some kind of an anxiety, that you want to make sure the next one is good too. But when it comes to the nitty-gritty of actually doing the work, of writing the script, of making the film, it's important to put those things aside and just to follow your own vision and to do your best to make the film that you believe in and that you believe an audience could enjoy and appreciate and understand and be challenged by. And that's what I'm working on now. I'm working on a new project now, and at some point you really have to just put everything aside and move forward.
It just has to be you, your collaborators, the project, and nothing else in your mind?
I'm glad you mentioned the collaborators. Yeah, that's a big part of it. Michael Simmons, my cinematographer, my co-writer, and others. But no, I do think about the audience with every film. It's incredibly important as we're working to make sure, can the audience understand what's going on? I don't even just mean plot-wise, which is critical. Can the audience understand what's going on in the story? But if we're going after a certain emotion, or if we're going after certain ideas or certain questions, do we think the audience can understand those? And increasingly, what's been on my mind with each film, Chop Chop and then Goodbye Solo even more, would an audience be engaged by this story? And not just wonderful people like you who love movies and are cinephiles, but I honestly, and my collaborators also, we think about our moms, our brothers, people who like good movies but aren't necessarily cinephiles. Could they enjoy the movie also? So we're constantly thinking about the audience while we're working.
Is this primarily then a discussion literally among you and your team about what kind of audiences would enjoy this, or do you take the discussion to those potential audience members as well? I mean, do you guys talk to your moms while you're doing it, or are you talking about your moms among yourselves?
For example, the storyline I'm working on now, I'm hoping to do a Western next year, and it's a period film, and I was in North Carolina just a couple of days ago, and I was able to tell my brother the story and watch his reaction to it. I'm a firm believer that a filmmaker should be good at telling the story, and telling a story that would keep the person you're telling it to engaged. And I could see in my brother's face he really wanted to know what would happen next. Of course, family likes whatever you do, so yeah, your hope is that other people are going to like it too, and you also don't want to compromise as an artist. You have a vision, and you have to stay true to that. So it's quite a delicate balance.
Now, I want to ask you more about this new project, but first we should talk about Goodbye Solo, the latest film, which I've seen and loved, even in screen or disc format. I want to talk about how this project grew, and grew is not a term that I use lightly. It does seem to have grown more than it was designed and then forced into being. Now, the element of a location in this film in North Carolina, Blowing Rock, could you tell us first what Blowing Rock is? Because I think some people won't know.
Blowing Rock is a real-life location which serves as the finale of the film, and it's in the Blue Ridge Parkway near Boone. It's a real-life place I've been going to since I was a child with my family, and it is known for having a wind that is strong enough that it could literally blow a person back up into the sky. Also that it could blow snow or sticks or anything you throw off of it, it would blow it back up. And this real-life location became paramount to me believing that this film could have a chance to be good, that the story could have a chance to reach another level. Another element to Blowing Rock is the Blue Ridge Parkway, that area. In the autumn season, which the movie was shot in October, that is known as the most scenic place in America to see the changing of the leaves. There's just an explosion of colors in those mountains, and if you're lucky, you'll also catch a very magical fog, and we happen to have gotten all of them in the finale of the film.
What did you have in your mind, and did your collaborators have in their minds before Blowing Rock ignited the creative fire, if that's actually the metaphor that applies here?
What really got me started on the story was encountering a real-life taxi driver from Senegal who was living and working in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, which is where I was born and raised. And I met him actually, believe it or not, years ago before I had even made Man Push Cart. And I was just taken by this guy. He was incredibly friendly, very charming, very open, very curious, and I learned that not only he drove a taxi, but he actually didn't own one, and he would have to hire a taxi to take him to and from work, or he would have to walk. And I thought this was very interesting, and I later went back after Man Push Cart and spent a lot of time with him, several months with him, riding around, doing the night shift, just kind of sitting in his taxi, watching where he went, who he picked up, what he did. And during that time period, I lived with my brother when I'm in North Carolina, and I would pass by 2 assisted living homes to go to my brother's house every day, and I noticed an elderly man standing by the side of the road with a walker. And this is kind of strange to be standing by the road in a suburban town, and I started honking and waving at this gentleman, and I noticed he would smile and wave back, and while that made me happy, it also made me deeply sad about his condition in our society, and in general the condition of the elderly in our society. And I had also done volunteer work in a nursing home, and in my mind I put this man into the back of the taxi with this storyline, which is the storyline of the film, that this elderly man wants Solo, the taxi driver, to take him to Blowing Rock in 2 weeks' time, exactly on October the 20th, and he does not plan to come back from there. And the driver thinks he knows the reason why, which is that the old man wants to leave and never come back, and he decides within these 2 weeks to try and change his mind.
I've got to know more about this experience of you tailing along with this Senegalese cab driver. What did you get surprised by early on? I mean, you must have learned a whole lot in this experience, but what was unexpected when you were sitting in the seat of his cab and just going on with him, with getting fares with him and all that?
There's a few things that you should know. One is, for example, in a big city like New York, it's mainly more affluent people who can afford to take taxis, except in rare situations you're going to an airport or you're really late at night and you have to take a cab. In general, you have to have money to take a cab. In a suburban town like Winston-Salem, it's actually people who don't have much money who take cabs because they cannot afford car insurance, oil change, tire change, etc. And so predominantly the people who were coming and going from the cab in the neighborhoods we were driving in were poor neighborhoods or very, very working class neighborhood. So that was the first thing that I came to learn. The next thing that really struck me was really the nature of this guy specifically. Whoever got into his cab, whatever mood they were in, even if they were angry with him for reasons that had nothing to do with him, they were just angry. By the time he dropped them off, they were happy. And he had that ability. He had that spirit. That kind of became a big part of the film.
And as this guy was a model for the title character in Goodbye Solo, the character from Senegal, the cab driver, it's the same sort of deal I had while I was watching it. I thought, if only I could get a ride in Solo's cab, I think I would be a lot happier coming out of it. And this was, how close was Solo in the filming to this fellow you were writing with?
The real guy, Solo?
Yeah.
Solo, the character Solo is played by Suleiman Sisavane, and his nickname is really Solo, and it was kind of great for the film, so we kept it. And Solo in real life is a trained actor. This is his debut film. He does see the glass half full. He is friendly. He is curious. But it's a performance. Solo doesn't talk that much. He doesn't talk that quickly. He had never used expressions like big dog or big booty, original player. These were actually expressions the real driver would use. And Solo was lucky enough to meet him a handful of times, and that really helped him understand the language and the feeling. So he had similarities, but it's also a performance, and I applaud him for it, and he's already taking off. He's now gotten a manager and an agent, and he's in going to be in an off-Broadway play by Scott Elliott, the Tony Award winner of Avenue Q, so he's already off on his way.
I have to ask this because it was something that just piqued my curiosity. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but the actor playing Solo is Ivorian and the character is Senegalese. Was there anything that had to be done to make Ivorian play Senegalese?
Well, no, not really, because Solo, his dad is from Ivory Coast, but his mom is from Senegal.
Oh.
So he knew Senegalese culture deeply. He had spent time there, and he kind of grew up between Ivory Coast and France, but had spent plenty of time in Senegal, and his mom is from Senegal. So it was very easy for him to understand. The cultures aren't terribly different. There are of course differences, but he understood both cultures, and it was important. I mean, for example, why does he want to help a stranger? Because he doesn't know this old man, and he decides to help him, and there are many, many reasons. And culturally, one of the ones that Solo told me during the audition and casting process and the rehearsal process that really stayed with me was he said that in his culture, which is an oral tradition, that when an elderly person dies, it's like a library that burns. And that really made him helped him understand the character. He said he would imagine his great aunt or his uncle or his father or his grandfather as the person of William, and that really made him understand.
In the three major films that I've seen of yours, Man Pushcart, Chop Shop, and Goodbye Solo, this theme of helping people and the importance of helping and kind of the difficulty of helping in real life, it's something that I draw out as a viewer, but was this deliberately a chosen theme for all of those, or did it just happen to be an interest of yours?
I think I've noticed it more now that Solo's been made, looking back on them. I do think it's something that I've been interested in. I really do believe in the importance of one human being's interaction with another, and I've always wondered what is our role in this world, and how do we treat one another. Especially in these three films, the characters aren't necessarily in positions where they can help people, by which I mean they don't lead luxurious lives where they have plenty of time and money and resources just to help. In fact, their back is to the wall usually. They're not in the best of situations, yet they still make huge efforts to help people or to try to make their life and other people's lives better. And I respect this resilience, and I find something inspiring about that in the human will, that even in tough conditions, these characters are trying to do good or trying to better their lives and the lives of people around them. And I've found that something extraordinary about the characters and about the human spirit.
To backtrack a bit to bringing these particular characters, Solo and William, to life, when you had your ideas about, you had the model of the real Solo, when you had the idea from the man you'd seen standing there on the sidewalk for the older Southerner in the back seat, what is the next step, or what was the next step concretely for you to bring these characters to life once you had these ideas?
Well, I started working on a fictional story, and my writing process goes hand in hand with spending time in the location and in meeting real people and then in casting, by which I mean I'm in a constant state of writing and rewriting and rewriting and rewriting as I spend time in these places. So the first step was to write a basic treatment, and then I started spending time with the real guy. And doing that, I started to understand details and milieu and feelings and characters that could come and go from the taxi. and then little by little started piecing together the fiction. And then I called in my co-writer, who also had co-written Chop Shop. Once I had the basic foundation down, I usually get her involved, and then we keep building the story from there. And once you cast a film and start meeting the people who are going to play the parts, you kind of tweak the characters a little bit. You change how they talk. Maybe certain things change a little bit based on who you've cast. Dialogues may change a little bit. The core of the film probably doesn't change much at that stage, but you tweak the dialogue for the way they talk, colloquialisms they may use, or expressions they may like.
I certainly want to reiterate this just because I find this working method so cool. So is it that, would this be a good way to describe it, that you have something you write, but with every iteration it's like a feedback loop with the real world, like you get a little more reality involved in the project, which changes the fiction, which then changes the direction you go with the reality, which feeds back into the fiction. Is that at all accurate?
It is, and there's a filmmaker I really love called Robert Flaherty. His most famous films are Nennik of the North and Man of Erin. He's a documentary filmmaker, but actually I think he's just a great filmmaker. There's great storytelling happening, and he talked a lot about the Inuit people in Nennik of the North and how when they would see a rock and they wanted to make a sculpture, they wouldn't go to the rock and make the sculpture they wanted. They would look at the rock and say, "Rock, what do you want to be?" And I think that's important, is to look at life. And, of course, we're talking about fictional films. They've been very carefully planned. There's a very detailed script. The shots are very detailed. The performances are worked and reworked and between me and the actors. And everything is controlled. But at the same time, you're also trying to be true to life, not to impose yourself and your vision too much on the reality of the world. So it's kind of a very, as you said, back and forth process. Oftentimes it seems contradictory or paradoxical, but so life is, and you try your best to get in there.
How much does this process end up shifting the film from whatever piece of fiction you had originally envisioned it as being? How far did this one move away, just based on what you got from actors and locations and collaborators?
Well, one thing that happened was the real taxi driver, about 9 months before I wanted to make the film, kind of told me that he didn't want to be in it.
Oh.
Yeah, and I had assumed he was going to play the lead, and that really kind of, I was very startled by that, because that in my previous films that never happened. The people always were excited to be in the film, and actually it matches his character, because he's, like in the film, kind of that humble guy who doesn't want the attention for what he's doing. And so it kind of matched his personality. I actually really respect him for his decision, and we're still close friends. And that threw me off, though, and at some point I was wondering if I should even make the film. And thanks to good friends, they encouraged me to keep moving forward. And in a way, it helped me to rewrite the story and move slightly away from him as a real-life character. And I think it really helped to deepen the relationship between William and Solo and kind of freed me a little bit more from the reality of the situation and more into maybe the reality of the emotion, which then ends up being in potentially more fiction.
This brings up something I certainly wanted to talk to you about, which is it's your method of selecting and using actors. I've read in other interviews, you've mentioned that in the projects you've done, you have liked to, whether or not it's been a necessity, you've liked to use actors that viewers won't generally recognize as big-name actors. And it kind of validates an opinion that I've held, because I always find even the best actors can be distracting because you know them, quote-unquote, know them from real life. And is that the same way you feel, I should ask? Is that the advantage in actors that are less known is that they can better inhabit a character?
Well, it depends on what the film is. In these three films, we're dealing with, you mentioned A.O. Scott's piece on realism. We're dealing with films that I really wanted the audience to believe that they were real. I wanted, that we're dealing with a social, with kind of a poor working class folks. From film to film, they vary. In Chop Shop, they're quite poor. They're street orphans, no home. In fact, Solo is probably the best off of the three characters. And there seems to be something disrupting if that person is inhabited by Will Smith, for example. I think he's a talented actor. If he just put his face up on the screen, you can't help but look at it. He has that magic. And I love him in a lot of his films, but it's kind of hard for me to get terribly engaged in him in a movie like Pursuit of Happiness, because I know him and his son have come in a Lamborghini and they live in a mansion and they're not really concerned with these things. and that's a big difference between film and theater. Then you're getting into a difference of actors that are known and of actors who were celebrities, and how do you handle that? I mean, Hitchcock, maybe people always say he used Jimmy Stewart to his advantage, his status, but that was a different time period. There's a difference in, for example, putting Cillian Murphy, a really great actor, in a movie, or putting Tom Cruise in a movie. Both are known, but one is his status kind of overwhelms everything else that's happening.
And so if this had been, or let's say if you had made a film about, or if you were to make a film about a wealthy celebrity character, Will Smith might actually be someone you would actively desire in that role.
It would make sense. I mean, even, for example, I said I want to make a Western. It's a period film. I'm going to get more known actors. That doesn't mean I'm going to get, Tom Cruise or Will Smith. I, again, think there's a difference between that stardom and that huge celebrity status and a, let's say, a working actor, an actor that we know and respect and can really appreciate, but isn't in a magazine every single day. For example, Benicio del Toro, of course we know who he is, but his status doesn't really necessarily disrupt the movie. Do you know what I'm saying?
I know what you mean. Yeah, there is a difference there, and it's not one I can easily articulate, but there is a line between an actor I see frequently because they are very hardworking and one that I happen to see on a lot of magazine covers.
It's very different. For example, Ken Loach has a great ability to mix non-professionally trained actors with actors. For example, Cillian Murphy, who I thought was amazing in Wind That Shakes the Barley, but he doesn't pull you out of the film. You don't remember seeing him on every single magazine cover the way you would if it was Brad Pitt, for example. And again, that doesn't mean to say that I think Brad Pitt or Will Smith are good or bad actors. I think they're fine. They're good actors. But they've become overwhelming in terms of pop culture, and that has to be taken into account when you're working on a project. The same way that if I'm going to make a Western that takes place in 1850, I don't think an actor that you would recognize would be as distracting or have the same impact on a movie like Goodbye Solo or Man Push Cart or Chop Shop, where we're dealing with contemporary time, where I want you to believe the film really happened, where there's no musical score, where there's this sense, as A.O. Scott said, of realism. That sense wouldn't really come across as easily with an actor. I do think, for example, Michelle Williams in Wendy and Lucy, you don't really know who that is or you don't recognize her. There are, of course, ways around this. Red West is known. He's been in plenty of films. He has that long history with Elvis Presley. He's acted for Coppola, Oliver Stone. He's been in big Hollywood films like Roadhouse and Glory Road. But he's not disruptive to Goodbye Solo. Usually people said to me, I think I've seen this guy, or that guy looks like my uncle or my grandfather. And that's just perfect, Robert Duvall had been in the backseat, it would have been a different film.
Could we formulate it like this, just very generally, very broadly speaking, that the less foreign the context of a film, or the less foreign the context the story of the film happens in, the less familiar the actors need to be?
I think that could be a way of saying it. And of course, there's always anomalies. Rocco and His Brothers, one of the great films, Alain Delon is in it.
Oh, yes, that's true.
And Rocco and His Brothers is an amazing film, and he never seems to distract. I don't know what it was like at that time period. I know Alain Delon was incredibly famous, and I'm sure he was on covers of magazines. Of course, we're in a different world now in terms of internet, magazine, TV, shows dedicated to celebrity. And also, Alain Delon was a different kind of actor. There was something very Bressonian about his performances. And that's a very controlled acting. So who knows? It's a long, it's always going to be a long conversation, or one that you could come and go at in different angles. And I was very excited to work with Solo and Red, both of them trained actors, Red with a long history. It was a different experience. I enjoyed it. Sometimes it was very similar to working with a non-trained actor. Other times there were differences, and it just depends on the project, really.
Now, you're only getting more well-known and more respected and all that, and I can imagine myself that at a certain point there are going to be, or if there, I'm sure there probably are already, very big names that are interested in working with you. And I imagine, tell me if you foresee this as well, but there would be a bit of a trade-off involved in that because, of course, a huge name like a Will Smith is going to draw more of an audience into your movie, but then it'll have that same problem where they will also have that celebrity factor. Is that something you think about in the future?
I look at a handful of directors that have been fortunate to make films, to keep making films, to have made many films, to have remained true to their own vision, yet to have continued with each film to reach a wider and wider audience, and to do it for a lifetime. I mean, a great example is Robert Altman, may he rest in peace, who was an independent director working with known actors, reaching big audiences, and he never really strayed from his vision. P.T. Anderson is another director that I respect in terms of working in and out of the system, for example, but doing his own projects. I mean, There Will Be Blood doesn't look like a movie where he compromised for anything. He made the film he wanted to make. And then on the East Coast, we have Jim Jarmisch, who's been doing it for a long time and doing it his way. And I respect these people. It's very hard, Werner Herzog, and it's very hard to do this. And my hope is to somehow find a way to continue to navigate these waters and to be able to make films that I want to make that can reach an audience and not have to make compromises I don't want to.
Now, this A.O. Scott piece we've discussed about the neo-realism, upon reading that, I mean, how easy or hard was it to envision yourself as being part of this new tradition that A.O. Scott was hewing out of the cinematic rock there, or at least the rock of cinematic journalism?
I think he is correct to notice there's similarities between these films. I agree with a lot of what he said. Some people may say, oh, well, it's a label, labels aren't good. Oh, of course labels aren't good, but labels are the beginning of a conversation. What do you want to call it? How do you want to phrase it? Are the films different? Are they similar? The films are different, and they have similarities. And there is something going on. And it is a kind of a movement of films, even if the filmmakers aren't necessarily in touch or talking about it. There is something happening, and he's right to talk about it, and it's the beginning of a conversation. Brody and the New Yorker disagreed. Great, because it got more people talking about it. In fact, I disagree with most of what Brody critiqued in A.O. Scott's piece, but it made me even think about it more concretely. His criticism helped me understand more clearly what A.O. Scott was saying and what I think. And then other people started talking about it. So this is wonderful. It's been a long time since we've had real discussions about cinema in America, and I'm grateful to A.O. Scott and to people like Roger Ebert, and I'm grateful that I'm a part of it.
More broadly speaking about a concept like realism, one of the most refreshing things I find about all your films that I've seen is that they have so much realism to them. I mean, that's kind of vague, but you're not a fan of escapism, correct?
No, not really. I mean, I understand people want to sometimes go to a movie to escape, but and I that's fine. I appreciate it. I'm not one of those people, and I think that reality is so engaging and so interesting that why should I have to escape from it? And in general, as a society, we're constantly being trained and being encouraged to escape, not just in film, but in our day-to-day life, in our conversations with one another. We're constantly erecting barriers to eliminate reality, and I don't personally want to do that, and I actually think reality can be really engaging, and if a film is real, that doesn't mean that it's boring or dark or depressing at all. It can be quite engaging, and it can have humor in it, like Goodbye Solo does. It can have, hope in it. It can also have dark things in it, There's a man in Solo who doesn't want to be helped, and there's a man who wants to help. And the reality has all these things in it, and why should I turn away from it?
You seem like a director who is eager to learn things from his own projects, and as far as realism is concerned, with this type of research you have to do, whether it be hanging out with pushcart vendors in New York or hanging out with cab drivers, I mean, it seems like you relished this opportunity to learn another life. Is that correct?
I mean, aren't you excited to be a journalist?
I am, very.
I mean, I always envy you. I love this column in New York Times, This Land, this guy Dan Barry, who gets to just travel across America and big towns, small towns, big cities, and find stories. Recently on NPR, there was someone who was going around across America talking to people about how the recession, has impacted them. I'm jealous of these jobs. Why should I make a film about a young, guy who likes to read books and makes movies? This sounds really boring to me. I'd love to learn about new people, different experiences. Even the Western I've been researching for a year. What a joy to learn more about that time period in American history and to visit historical sites and to visit real landscapes and to encounter, as many people as possible to talk to them about that time period in American history. I feel lucky that I can do that. It's that, curiosity that helps keep me engaged in the story and keeps me, kind of lights that fire to really want to make that film. I mean, I can't wait to see the Western,
Now, how have you gotten into other people's, maybe this isn't the best way to put it, but how have you gotten into other people's lives in the past to research these films? Like Man Push Cart, you reportedly hung out with the vendor. How do you make yourself a place in someone else's life like that effectively? Because I imagine myself getting rebuffed if I ever tried to do that.
Well, of course there are going to be people who don't want to be, don't want to talk to you and don't want to be a part of it and don't want to, open themselves up. But people are oftentimes very friendly and they're oftentimes very hungry to communicate and hungry for their stories to be known and even oftentimes just to find a friend, someone to talk to. It's amazing how you can strike up conversations with people. Goodbye Solo is about someone who's helping a stranger. And I remember when I was telling people about the story, they said it sounds really interesting, sounds like a great idea and could be a great film, but why is he helping a stranger? And I thought to myself, I have to make the film. Because why are we not asking this of ourselves? Why are we not more engaged with strangers? Why are we not more engaged? And I think the political climate is reflecting that people are hungry for that. Our president was a community organizer.
For those just tuning in, this is the Marketplace of Ideas from Colin Marshall Radio. At our website, colinmarshallradio.com, you will find the complete Marketplace of Ideas interview archive, as well as other podcasts and more. My guest is filmmaker Ramin Bahrani, director of the new Goodbye Solo. I think this is very, very important because, of course, while watching Goodbye Solo myself, the question does not immediately, but near immediately comes to the fore that William is getting fairly hostile towards Solo, and by a certain point you wonder why Solo still has these friendly conversational overtures for him. And I did start to wonder watching it, thinking, well, I shifted from why is he doing this to, well, what can I learn from Solo? You probably had the same view on your own character, trying to learn from him.
Well, I really appreciate you look at a film like that, because oftentimes we're so used to the same kind of film over and over again that when a film does something, instead of asking why is it doing that, people are just quick to dismiss. And it's often when you just ask why, if you trust the film and the filmmaker and you just ask why are they doing that, it usually can lead you to the answer. And I really appreciate that you say that and that you do that when you watch films. There are lots of reasons. For one thing, I don't actually think William's a bad guy or a mean guy. I think William knows that if he is going to go through with this, if he is going to leave this world on October the 20th in 2 weeks, he can't become close to Solo or to Solo's stepdaughter Alex, who's a big part of the film, this 9-year-old girl. He can't become close to them because it's just going to make things harder for him and harder for them. William is talking to his grandson, who is a ticket attendant in a cinema, who doesn't know him. And it's a question as to why he doesn't tell this grandson who he is. Because in William's mind, this is a selfish thing to do. Why should I announce myself to my grandson when I know I am not going to change my mind, and he knows he is not going to change his mind? This would be a selfish thing to do. And I think partially Solo can understand that, even if it's unconsciously. I also think, thank God the critics and the reviews of the film have been incredibly positive. Oftentimes they're right that Solo is studying to be a flight attendant. In fact, he's not. It's a dream he just dreams about, and he's given it up. He begins to study again upon knowing William. And there's something about William's determination that in a way inspires Solo to change. It's Solo who really changes in the course of the film. And part of that change is his determination. Part of that is to pursue his dream, to tell his wife, I love you, but you have to let me do this. And that's what he has to learn with William. If he cares about that man and he comes to love this person as a friend, he has to do something very hard, which is let him go, even if it's painful to him. So I look at his action on that mountaintop when he lets William go as a selfless act of love. And it's all the more challenging because, one, he doesn't know exactly why William wants to do it, and two, hours before he is to take him to the mountain, he's read in a notebook that William cares about him and his future. and his stepdaughter's future, a future which William is about to put an end to. Yet he still lets him go. He still stands strong for him and lets him go, even though it's painful to him. And that's an incredibly generous act.
And it seems to me Solo could easily have let another one of the cab drivers in Winston-Salem take him, and not have had to. And he could have pretended William didn't jump or decided to live, and yet he voluntarily put himself in the way of the pain.
In fact, he knows that if from the scene one of the movie, he understands if I don't take this $100 deposit, another driver will take it and run. And just take him there and never think twice about it.
This determination that Solo has, I'm glad you've mentioned this, because it's a common thing, I think, for your protagonists. Solo is determined to save William. In Chop Shop, Ale was determined to realize his dream of a taco truck as he works there in the auto shop in Queens. In Man Push Cart, Ahmad was realizing his dream of owning the push cart. How much does this determination resonate with you? I mean, it must, if it's been so central to your protagonists.
Concretely into my life, if you don't have these kind of feelings, you can't make these films. And more abstractly, in all of our lives, there's a determination just to move forward and somehow to strip through the parts of our society that don't really relate to us as human beings. It is very hard to be determined to move forward the way you think is right in your soul. I've just finished reading an amazing book, which I had never had a chance to read before, called Black Boy, which is Richard Wright's biography, basically. It's his own story of his own life. He's told it in a fictional way. And, I mean, you just look at that and you're like, what a determination it requires to live this person's life and not to turn right or left or to go in a direction that you know is not correct. And I find these characters inspiring to my own life. For example, Alejandro, who's 12, and is trying to do everything in this world for his 16-year-old sister, for them to be together, which, as you said, that dream is a truck that they could live and work in, and he would keep his sister with him and they could have a life together. He's 12, he has no home, no family, he's living in the harshest of conditions, yet he never gives up, he's incredibly resilient, he still has a smile on his face in the end. And then I think about my own life and I'm thinking, how could I complain when I'm looking at that kid?
Exactly, the comparison will hearten you kind of no matter what you're doing.
And that goes to the idea of realism and the idea of actors is, look at what Solo does in Goodbye Solo. He's so selfless in his love towards William in the mountain to let him go. And it's just Solo. It's just a taxi driver from Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and you believe it. That's different than if Will Smith had done it. Well, of course he could do it. He hasn't, he's got all the resources in his hands to do it. And I mean the real person Will Smith, not the actor. That's a different emotion that can be created by techniques of realism, which mean hopefully faces that you don't distract you. It means a camera style which isn't, the camera is not moving all over the place, and there is not a musical score. There's plenty of music in the film, but there's not a score. It means the storylines aren't melodramatic or outside the realm of our believability. And again, I would stress that does not mean the film is dark, boring, or depressing. In fact, Goodbye Solo is engaging from scene one. From scene one, you're trying to find out what happens next. And it has humor, and it has a very active story. And I think people want to see that.
One of the planks of this brand of realism, it seems to me, is that the characters, while watching the film, the characters seem to live before the film began and, to some extent, after the film is over. And this is funny because it's one of the things I like most about your films and films like yours. But when I read criticisms when I read negative reactions to, for example, your films or others, they'll say things like, well, we don't know how Ale became an orphan. We don't know how Ahmad's wife died. We don't know how Solo exactly got where he is. We don't know almost a thing about William. What do you chalk that up to what negative comments there are, and there aren't many, spring from the same thing as, for example, why I like this style and why you like to work in it?
Well, I think it's presumptuous, first of all, to assume that we can know everything about a person. I also differ in that I don't think those details help us understand anything. And I don't think these details open doors to the audience. I actually think they close them. And by explaining all these factual details of someone's life, the audience gets less engaged. they are less able to invest themselves and people they know and experiences and emotions that they've sincerely felt in their lives into the characters. Because if you explain everything, you block those doors. And it's also this whole idea of wrapping things up in the end of the film. The end of all three films end correctly for what the films are about. You know, for example, Chop Shop is Alejandro wants to do everything for him and his sister to be together and be loving together. And in the end, you see that they are. Now, are they still orphans or not, or what happens to them? I don't know. I can't go to the end of their life. And even if I could go to the end of their life and stand next to their grave when they were, 80 years old and had died, I still don't know what's going to happen because they would have impacted people along the way. This idea that our life can be wrapped up in the end of a film never makes any sense, doesn't make any sense to me.
It seems like, just thinking about it now, that finding where to end your films, it must either be the most natural thing in the world or the biggest challenge. Where does it fall on that spectrum?
It is the most important thing for me is the ending, and in fact, I usually don't start until I know the ending. I find it very hard to begin extensive writing until I know the end, and the entire film is formulated based on the ending. From scene one all the way to the end, everything is done for the ending. And I think the ending of the three films is the summation of what I think the majority of the film is actually about, and it's the vision that I have for those characters and for their experiences. I find endings to be of paramount importance.
The lack of a score that we've mentioned in Goodbye Solo, I was thinking about this, just about in relation to films in general, that a score is almost a damned if you do, damned if you don't proposition, because a score seems to either underscore, as it were, the emotions that are already present in the performances and in what you're seeing, and thus it robs it of its power, or a score can try to fill in emotions that fail to come through in a performance or in the mise en scène or whatever is there. But when is a good time for you to use a score? When do you think it actually helps to use non-diegetic music in a film?
Well, Man Push Card has it. There were one or two longer sequences of music that go on for maybe, let's say, a minute or so. And then there were a handful of 10-second pieces of music. Looking back now, I wonder about the shorter pieces, but I still believe in the longer ones. And in fact, the scenes were made with the understanding that music would be there. It's a tricky subject, and I still think about it. At Chop Shop, I knew there would never be music. It made no sense to the film at all, and there's so much noise in the film, and there's actually 25 or 30 songs in the film coming from radios and cars and garages, and that's been chosen carefully, and in those situations could either act as a way to heighten the emotion of the moment or to counterpoint it, depending on what scene it is. Goodbye Solo is the same. There's plenty of music in the film coming from the cab or from the bar or from a nearby place, etc. I tried to put a musical score in Solo, and I really found that it pulled me out of the film. I came to believe less in what I was seeing. I was really, I think, because of the two performers, Red West and Suleiman, I was so engaged in the story as a viewer because of their performances, and I believed them so much. Putting music on top of the images really pulled me out of the film. So it didn't make sense. I don't have hard rules that there should not be music in a film, but I take it very seriously. Godard said tracking the camera is a moral decision. For me, music is the same.
It does seem to me that the effort that goes into sound design is it's equal to or greater than what would have gone into a score, because I don't know, maybe I'm just making this up, but in Chop Shop, one of my favorite things was that it was so much of it took place, for those who haven't seen the film, in a long row of garages, and you would hear music, but there were several different layers, if I'm not mistaken, there would be music coming from a faraway garage or a nearby garage or a faraway car or a near car. Is that layered construction a common thing to your films? Because it's most noticeable there.
I really appreciate you saying that, and it's done with a huge amount of energy by my sound team, Dig It Audio in New York, who's done all three of my films, and Man Push Cart was the same. I mean, every jackhammer, every car that drives by, all has been chosen and done with an extensive amount of work and decision-making. In Chop Shop also, buzzing lights and all kinds of sounds and noises, and the music was selected, out of hundreds and hundreds of songs. Even if it's just 10 seconds, it was, really a conscious decision. And in Goodbye Soul the same. Each atmosphere and each location and each song that was picked for each car scene or neighboring, for example, when Solo gets into a fight, there's a music you're hearing from a car that you can't even see on camera. It's just somewhere over there to the left. And then, of course, in the end of the film, the sound of the wind. This is almost like 30 tracks of wind that have been mixed together and chosen and layered and picked just for the right moment. And I'm grateful that I have really great collaborators in sound, and they really put a lot of energy into that.
This brings us to the issue, once again, of your collaborators, because, of course, we talk about a Ramin Bahrani film, but we don't mean just you. There are collaborators that you work with and have worked with, I believe, for all of your films. Now, we know that Michael Simmons, your cinematographer, is very closely associated with you on the films. I mean, you work as a team. Who else is always part of a Ramin Bahrani film so far?
Well, Michael Simmons is important to mention. He's not just a cinematographer, but he is there from the idea stage. He reads the script. He helps pick the costumes. He's there in editing, and it's a great blessing for me and a wonderful collaboration and a relationship I really enjoy. And he shot other great films like Order of Mist, Margaret Brown's documentary, and my co-writer Zahara Azimi has been involved in Chop Shop and Goodbye Solo, and she'll be engaged in the Western as well. And our gaffer, Mark Koenig, has been there for all of them. Nicholas Elliott, who's an artist and a friend. He's a writer and a playwright and an actor. He was the AD, assistant director on the first two films, and the script supervisor on Goodbye Solo. My sound team has been the same. Bigot Audio, Tom Effinger, Abigail Savage, my people in the color, Jane, who does the color correction for the films at DuArt Laboratory. So I've been lucky that there's a handful of people in key positions that keep coming back. And when you find those people that know what you want and can elevate what you want and make it something better, you do everything you can to make sure they're there and that they're happy.
I want to get into the notion of how Goodbye Solo is different from the films that preceded, because anybody who watches all three in a row will notice many similarities between Man Push Cart and Chop Shop, but fewer between Chop Shop and Goodbye Solo. Now, it's of course the obvious thing is that you move from New York City to Winston-Salem for Goodbye Solo, but what else in the process was very different for you between the first two films and the third?
I think there were two other. The one you mentioned is critical, the change of location, and two other elements. One was to the two lead actors, Suleiman and Red West. That for the first time I was working with the leads as professionally trained actors, which meant I actually showed them a script. In my previous films, I never showed the script, and even in Goodbye Solo, the rest of the cast is populated by non-professional locals, and none of them had seen a script or even knew what the film was about, and they didn't learn what the film was about until it just screened in Winston-Salem a few days ago. The other critical difference was I really made an effort to push in the storytelling. All three films are, especially Chop Shop, is really a classical storytelling. It's actually a three-act structure, and it is a dramatic narrative. Even though oftentimes critics who love the film, Chop Shop, said that it didn't have a narrative story, it does, and it's actually a three-act structure, and it's very, very correct in its dramatic progression. Goodbye Solo, I think, is even more so. I really wanted the relationship between the two men to be the deepest and strongest of the three films. The relationship between two people would be the biggest part of the film, and that was a very conscious and deliberate effort in the screenwriting, as well as the added element of humor. I think Chop Shop does have a lot of humor in it, but here I think there's even more, and I was really excited by that and excited to see that it worked. This film, actually, watching it on a DVD, is so different watching this one with an audience, which I hope you get a chance because of the humor, and also because of seeing those men's faces on a big screen. It's a really different experience, and I was happy that the humor worked.
There's this quote that I read from you. I believe it was included in Ebert's blog post about you, but it was the more you risk, the more you risk, the better you do. Something like that. Perhaps you recall it.
Well, certainly you want to risk with each project. It's important. Otherwise, you're resting on your laurels, and we've tried to risk with each film. I think the Western is probably going to be the biggest risk of all, and it's also really important to be critical of your own work. And I can assure you that the staunchest critics of my work are me, my cameraman, and my co-writer, and we're we try to be very critical of our work while we're making it and also after it's finished in order to try to make the next films better. And I think it's important for filmmakers, young filmmakers like me who are just starting out to not to surround yourself with yes people, but to surround yourself with people who can make your vision stronger and are also critical of you, as long as you respect what they're saying. I think that's very important.
What did you and your team regard as the riskiest elements of Goodbye Solo?
One of the most challenging parts was exactly making sure the audience could believe that this person would that Solo would do this for a stranger, and a stranger who appears off-putting and doesn't want help. I never knew in the end if the audience would accept this or not. That was obviously a make or break for the film. Other than that, I would say it was the ending at Blowing Rock. Would that work or not? I believed in it, but in the end, you don't know how an audience is going to react to that ending.
What would cause that ending to fail? I mean, hypothetically, in your mind.
It's the mystery of what ends up, how a work ends up translating to an audience at its time, and you don't know that. It's impossible to know. I was just this morning talking with somebody about Jim Jarmisch's film Dead Man, which I think is his best film.
Oh, so do I.
I mean, I think, without a doubt, it's his best film, and it premiered in Cannes, and he's a darling in Cannes. They love whatever he does, they love it, and he was booed. And the film came out, it was not a success, it was a failure when it came out, and then it ended up being on almost every critic's top 10 films of the decade of the 90s. So you just don't know. And maybe it wouldn't have been. Maybe no one would have cared in the end. You never know. There's always a mystery between will what you're doing translate to the audiences or not. And you just don't know.
Now, did anybody ever figure out, I mean, you're more inside than I am, figure out what happened to Dead Man to make it so poorly received initially?
No. In fact, in my conversation this morning, I was wondering why did people not like it in Cannes? I never got it. I haven't done the research to find out what it was that they didn't like about it. And then why a couple of years later it ended up being so highly regarded. I'm not really sure myself.
Now, I can't help but make this connection. Dead Man was, in a lot of ways, maybe all of them, a Western. You are also working on a Western. Dead Man, is that hanging above your head a little bit as maybe an ultimate fate you would like, but a short-term fate you would like to avoid for this movie?
I guess you could say that. I mean, really, you look at it mainly because it's his own, and that's important. He made it his own. And every artist wants to do that. They want to make sure they stay true to their own vision and not censor their imagination. I mean, there's so many great Westerns. The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, I think, is one of the greatest ones. And, of course, I am a fan of Good, the Bad, and the Ugly and Once Upon a Time in the West. And the Anthony Mann Westerns with Jimmy Stewart are so great. I mean, the Western I'm working on is not like any of these. It's just completely its own thing. And I don't know if audiences will accept it or not. I'm trying to tell the most engaging story I can and one that can work on different levels and one that I hope you would want to watch till the end and know what happens, but it's different. It's not like any Western I can think of.
It seems as if the weight of tradition might operate on you in even more ways than the Western, the legacy of the Western. Like I was thinking the other day, you are, of course, Iranian-American. It seems that certain cinephiles they hear that you have an Iranian name and an Iranian heritage, and the names that pop to mind are people like Kiarostami, Makhmalbaf. This is an intimidating crowd to be lumped in, especially when the lumping isn't 100% accurate. Do you ever find that you're put in that lineup?
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes people mention, especially Kiarostami, especially in relation to the new film, and that's fine. Of course, I love Kiarostami's films, and I love Amir Naderi's films. No, I don't find it intimidating, really, and I don't mean to say that arrogantly. I really mean to say you can't think about it too much. I like it when people notice the not-so-clear references. That's always more exciting somehow because sometimes the references aren't obvious, but they're there. I mean, Ebert's one of the people, probably because he discovered Scorsese also, he's one of the people that's recognized Scorsese in all of the films. And, Mean Streets was one of the critical films to me. And there are other directors I like that have nothing to do with my style of filmmaking. I mean, I love Buñuel. I love Fellini. But you wouldn't necessarily recognize them in my films.
When you have people asking you about the references to other films, other filmmakers in your films, how often do they point out references that were deliberate, and how many times do they point out references that maybe were less deliberate, more subconscious on your or another of your team's part?
It happens all the time. I mean, and it depends on where you are and who you're talking to. Man Push Cart, I mean, I still haven't had really enough people tell me Man of Erin, which was a big influence on the film, and that's before Italian neorealism, and was actually more closely connected to the project. Also, when Man Push Cart, for example, premiered in Italy, because the Italians are Italians, they were quick to say Antonioni, Eclipse, and they were right. Here and there, some people mention Hou Xiaoxian, which is true. Oftentimes, people talk a lot about Cassavetes with my films. I really like Cassavetes, but I can't say he was a huge impact on me as a filmmaker. I mean, I love his films, and in fact, Killing of a Chinese Bookie was important to Man Push Cart. But I think sometimes people read one thing and then it just becomes an issue, you know, like, oh, it's Cassavetes. You know? So, and I don't mind. I mean, thank God they're naming these directors, you know.
Yeah, you could do a lot worse.
Yes, I mean, these are the greats. And anyway, it's flattering to be mentioned. And the important thing is just to really try to do your own film and to try to make it your own. And with each film, I can assure you that Michael Simmons and I and my co-writer and I talk less and less about films and more just about life and what the film is really about and the simplest way to express that to an audience.
Now, we're running so close to out of time, but there is one thing that I can't resist asking you, which is all of your films have been, and the one in production sounds like it's very America-focused. You've been getting an America across in all these films, a very particular America. What is the America you want to depict? I know that sounds grand, but regardless.
All three of the films, and I appreciate you haven't once mentioned immigrant, because I know all the films deal with immigrants, but they deal with Americans. You know, and we're living in an age of Barack Hussein Obama, and he is an American, and he is our president, and that's what makes America great, is the ability for that to happen. And all three characters are also working class, and that's a big part of America, which for some reason is ignored in cinema. People say, I think mistakenly, that these are marginal characters. They're not marginal characters. They are the majority. The majority of people in this world and in America have to pay the rent, and that's not always easy, and they think about it. The majority of people in this country count how many times they can eat out a month, and that's never in a movie. And I would stress that doesn't mean the movie is about that, or that the movie has to be dark or depressing or boring. But at least those characters are recognizable to me and people I know who live like that, which is kind of normal life. The films could be about other things. It could be about William's relationship with Solo's relationship with William and what William wants to do and this journey these two men go on. But their milieu, their social class, their status in the society isn't the one we normally see in film, which tends to just be rich and not a problem in the world and white. The world I live in America seems to have a lot of other kinds of people in it. And that's always been what's made America great, and why not have that as part of film?
The new film, once again, is Goodbye Solo. Ramin Bahrani, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the program.
Thanks. I really appreciate it. Your questions were really, really insightful. I appreciate that a lot.
This has been The Marketplace of Ideas. I've been Colin Marshall. At colinmarshallradio.com, you'll find our complete Marketplace of Ideas interview archive, as well as other podcasts and more fun stuff. Our music is produced by Ben Althouse. Hear more of what he does at benalthouse.com. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.